with all these awesome kids. We have so many teachers that work with the kids. We're a church of about 200 people, and we did the math recently, and we have about, I'm definitely going to die. We have a church of about 200 people, and we have almost 100 people who volunteer at this church. So almost half of people pitch in and help with teaching kids, with greeting people, all kinds of things. And again, a lot of those people are teachers of the children. And so we're blessed to have so many people involved. We're blessed to have Chelsea playing the piano. It looks like a chord change or a key change every song, huh? Who played? Marlene? Where's she at? Dude, you were good. Isn't she? Yeah, you're playing Christmas Eve, huh? Man. Yeah, Marlene was on point today. Key change every song. So anyway, we're super blessed, aren't we, to have the church we have and the kids we have. Every church is in a different season of life, and I'm blessed that our church is in a season of life where we have the next generation of faith secured. And we have so many kids growing up in the Lord here, so that's a great blessing. Okay, now let's talk about genocide. Just kidding, just kidding. That's next week. I'm going to move this because this is going to be an issue. Good thing I can deadlift 45 pounds. Okay, so today, briefly, we're going to talk about King David. And to know about King David, you have to know kind of the male psyche. And there's two fantasies that every man has. Okay, the first one is we all want to die in a self-sacrificial blaze of glory while protecting our family. We all want to do that. Like if we could go like Bruce Willis did in Armageddon. Remember? He stayed on the meteorite to save Earth and sacrifice himself. Or like Iron Man. I am Iron Man, right? Sacrificed himself. And my favorite of all time, every male wants to go out like Boromir in The Lord of the Rings. Remember Boromir protected the hobbits when they're being overrun with the Uruk-hai? Okay, so that's sad. That's sad. So that's one male fantasy is we all want to die protecting our families. That'd be great. The second male fantasy is we all want to crash in the wild somewhere and survive on our own, and preferably kill a bear with our bare hands. We all think we can do it. And it doesn't matter that we grew up doing office jobs and indoors with heating and air conditioning our whole life. We all think we could outlast everybody on alone, and that if we were on the island and we had Wilson, we would have been just fine. But just for some reason, every man believes that. There's an expedition of 5 people who went to this place called Wrangel Island. Now, Wrangel Island, there's nothing there. There's still nothing there, actually. Russia owns it now. But this island is north of Siberia. So it's kind of cold there. And it's not very populated. And, well, it is populated by polar bears. Wrangel Island has the most dense population of polar bear dens in the entire world. And you know the saying about bears, any hunters know these sayings? If it's black, attack. If it's brown, lay down. If it's white, say goodnight. Right? If it's a black bear, try and scare it away because they're skittish. They're like feral cats. They're usually scared of you. If it's a brown bear, don't try and scare that away because it will murder you. And if it's a polar bear, you're just dead. Well, this expedition went up there, and what they were trying to do is they were trying to claim the island for Canada or the British Empire or something. This was the early 1920s. So there's 4 guys and 1 gal who goes up there. The gal who goes up there, her name was Ada Blackjack. And she had a pretty tough life. She was Inuit, and she married this guy. He was super abusive. They had a kid. And at one point, he just abandoned them. And they lived, anyway. Her dad died when she was very young, and her mom gave her to a Methodist orphanage. So she grew up in an orphanage. Later, she got abandoned by her husband. She had her kid. Her kid had tuberculosis, and she couldn't afford the treatments. So she gave her kid to this home for children, and her only goal was to make money so she could afford the tuberculosis treatments for her kid. She was an excellent seamstress, and that was about it. So she heard of this expedition where people were going to go to Wrangel Island. There was going to be a bunch of Inuit who were going to go, and there were going to be some explorers, some European American and European explorers. And what ended up happening is she almost didn't go because all of the Alaskans that were supposed to go, they all backed out. But she needed the money for her kids, so she decided to go. So they all went to this place. The guy who sent them, he gave them 6 months worth of rations, and he said, you can hunt a bunch of stuff up there, you'll be fine. We'll come back in a year with a ship. Well, the Bering Strait in that whole area froze over more than they anticipated. So the ship that was supposed to go get them had to turn back. And so they were stuck there for 2 years on this island, the 5 of them. They were very close to starvation, so 3 of them set out to go and try and find help. Nobody knows whatever happened to them. They were never found. And the only reason one of the guys stayed back is because he had really bad scurvy, and so he was bedridden. And they left Ada back so Ada could take care of him. And so Ada took care of this guy, and he was super mean to her the whole time he's taking care of her. Eventually he dies. So Ada is stuck on Wrangel Island with all of these polar bears by herself. North of Siberia, in the Arctic Ocean. And this is her survival situation. And you think, oh, well, she's Inuit. She knows how to survive in the wild. No, she grew up in a Methodist missionary school. And so she wasn't a survivalist at all. And she was actually had a fear, like a phobia of polar bears. Can you believe that? And so she's stuck on this island with all these polar bears, and she has a fear of polar bears. So what she would do is she would go up onto the shack, and she would look to see if there were any polar bears coming. That's how she spent a lot of her time. Well, eventually, the guy she was taking care of died, and she had to figure out how to get food. She was close to starvation several times. She figured out how to take reindeer hides and sew them together over, I don't know if it was wood or bone, but somehow she figured out how to make a boat so she could go to ice floes and hunt seal. Because seal are easy to hunt. Can you imagine making your own boat, going into Arctic water? And this area, by the way, is super cold. It's frost-free for about 2 weeks in July. The rest of the year, there's frost year-round. I mean, it's below freezing basically all year. Well, she did survive. She survived 8 months taking care of this guy, 3 months by herself, and then another explorer ship came by and they found her when they were exploring the island, and they took her back home. We all think, especially guys, that we would just survive in the wild. But have you ever been hunting? And hunting's pretty awesome, right? You have a gun with you, you're fine. But there's always a point when a hunter's out hunting where they're pretty sure they're gonna die. Like you don't see what it is that's tracking you. You didn't necessarily hear anything, but you just get the feeling in the dark there's something that's about to murder you. Anybody know what I'm talking about? And so even if you're used to it, we grow up in cities in such controlled environments, we forget what the wild is like. And when people go camping by driving out their $200,000 motor coaches and parking it with hookups, that's not as close to the untamed wild as you would think. I mean, especially think pre-industrial societies where we have no electricity, no roads, no cars, no internet, no radio, no TV. We don't have other countries making awesome clothes for us, right? Just think back to those times, and you're thinking this is how Jesus and those people lived. And the wilderness in the Bible, you see this thread about the wild going all the way through the Bible. In the beginning, everything's wild, right? There's this void. There's a bunch of waters, and the Spirit of God is hovering over these waters. And you're like, what's going on here? So God speaks, and he starts separating animals and land and water, and he does all this stuff. And then he puts this walled garden inside the earth called Eden. And it's a wall, and it's protected, and it's cultivated, and it's taken care of. And he puts humans there to work on it, right? You guys remember this from Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3? So God creates, he makes man, he makes female, he puts them in the garden, and the wall kind of keeps the wild out. But a little bit sneaks in, and there's a snake, and it's a big thing. But What happens after Adam and Eve sin? They're driven out of the garden. And then there's these cherubim who are put at the doors to protect, to make it so they can't get back into the safe, cultivated space. And they're afraid that they're going to die out there, and God actually kills an animal to make them clothes so that they can survive and demonstrate his power over the wild. So it's pretty sweet. But they go out, and things just get more wild. Humans start killing each other. They build one big city. God frustrates his plans. They scatter again. There's this flood. That's kind of wild. And you know what? Floods are a real danger in the world, are they not? Like, people die from floods all the time. And so the idea that this flood just covered the whole earth, that's literal chaotic wild breaking in upon the cities and the civilization we try and make. And then you keep going through the Bible and you see this theme of wilderness. Abraham is in a city, God calls him out of that, and he has to travel through all this wilderness to get to the next place where God is calling him. And there's all kinds of dangerous things that happen along the way. Then they're in Egypt, which is a civilized place, but then the Jews are driven out of Egypt and they have to go into what? The wilderness. And the wilderness in this case is the Sinai Peninsula, which is an enormous desert. See, if I had to go on a survival show, I'd want it to be somewhere like the Pacific Northwest. I'd want it to be a forest. I would not want it to be a desert. That's like my last choice. A desert. How are you going to be able to shelter the desert? Right? I don't know. No trees, no nothing. Some of you guys might know, but I would just be dead. But all these Jews had to go out in the desert and they had to live in the wild. And who's the most wild animal in that wild? Actually, the greatest wild, untamed, powerful force they encounter in the wilderness is God himself. Because nothing tames God. And there's this pillar of smoke, and then there's a pillar of fire, and when people rebel, the earth opens up and swallows them. He sends snakes among them. I mean, it's crazy. You should read it. It's bananas. So you go through, eventually, the Jews become their own nation, and they have a capital, and they have a city. And things are going well, and there's a guy who's the king of the city, and his name is David. And this is about 1000 BC. David is king of Jerusalem. But there's a couple times where David actually had to spend time in the wilderness. Some of the same wilderness that the Jews stayed in when they left Egypt. The first time David had to go to the wilderness is because the king at the time, his name was Saul, wanted to kill him. And so David went out to the wilderness and he engaged in guerrilla warfare and he survived out there with his warriors and he was out in the wilderness for a long time then. Now, do you think that would have been a good season in David's life? No. Like, for one thing, living in a desert is lame, right? But on top of that, the king actually wants to murder him. We watched this show. It only had one season. I think it was called Hunted or The Hunt, something like that. But they took, I'm going to mess it up, but they took 5 or 6 groups of 2, and they had them run from the cops. And if they could stay away from the cops for like 3 months or 100 days or something, they would get a bunch of money. And it was crazy to see the adrenaline. Like, the cops would find them on the highway, and they'd try and track them down, and they had these FBI agents tracking them down. It was a game, but it was crazy seeing just the fear that got into people when they were running from cops as a game. Now, I have friends who have actually run from the cops when it wasn't a game. And they also had a lot of fear too. So David is living in this stressful, constant state of fear where he's trying to stay away from the person who wants to kill him, a powerful person who wants to kill him. Well, he survives, he becomes king, and then he kind of loses it and he messes everything up. And then one of his sons rebels against him, takes the throne, and he has to leave the city, and his son wants to hunt him down and kill him. So he goes into the wilderness again as an older man, and he has to survive out in the wilderness again when his own son is trying to find him and execute him. And he survives. We don't know which time he's out in the desert, but one of the times when he's out in this wild, he writes this psalm. And it's Psalm 63. Can I talk about Tolkien a little more? Since you guys clearly don't know about the guy. So J.R.R. Tolkien, he was this Catholic dude. He was friends with C.S. Lewis, and he wrote the Lord of the Rings trilogy. He kind of wrote the Silmarillion, and he wrote The Hobbit. And then Amazon made an atrocious, terrible TV series that totally guts his legacy and memory. And to me, it doesn't exist, and it is not canon. But the Peter Jackson movie is really good. So, J.R.R. Tolkien, you can see in his stories how much travel there is and how much exploration there is in the wild. And his conception of his world is, it's pretty much wild everywhere and everything's very dangerous. But there's little pockets of safety where people or dwarves or elves or whatever I'm sounding very nerdy now, I'm realizing. But they've made civilization where things are safer. But there's still dangers out there in the wild. And this is kind of it's a universal theme through humanity that we're always trying to cultivate a space in our life that is organized enough to give space for us to flourish. Right? But the world is a crazy place, and it keeps crashing into us with its chaos. So Ada, she just wanted to have a family. When her husband abandoned her, that forced all kinds of chaos upon her she never asked for, right? And then on top of that, her son has tuberculosis. So that's more chaos that the world thrusts upon her she didn't ask for. And then she gets stuck on Wrangel Island for years, having to learn how to survive. And then when she came back, she was held for a hero for a little bit, and then guess what happened? You think, okay, she can make it now. She's going to get money. She's a celebrity. She's the female Robinson Crusoe. Finally, all of her suffering is going to pay off. Well, eventually, the person who originally put together the expedition and some other people, they started slandering her name because they were writing the books to make money off of it, and they wanted people to buy their books instead of hers. So they said the reason the person that left behind died is because she neglected him. She wanted him to die so she could survive. And so she disappeared deep into Alaska to escape the public eye because her reputation was being assassinated. See, that's something she didn't ask for. And we all are trying to make a pocket of civilization in our life where the chaos won't break in on it, but we don't always get to choose that, do we? Like sometimes people we love get sick. Sometimes we get sick. Sometimes a pandemic happens or we lose a job. Or people we thought were going to be there forever, they decide they want a new life with somebody else and they leave. So sometimes the dreams and hopes we have that we put together and we thought, I just need this little corner, I just need this little pocket so I can flourish and things can be okay. The wild breaks in over the walls and it invades our spaces. And David is living this day by day as he lives in a literal wilderness. And this is the song he writes in the midst of that. Psalm 63, verse 1, it says, a psalm of David regarding a time when David was in the wilderness of Judah. O God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you. My soul thirsts for you. My whole body longs for you in this parched and weary land where there is no water. I've seen you in your sanctuary. Is the sanctuary in the wild? No, the sanctuary is way over in Jerusalem. And he's not there now. So he's talking about a different time he saw God in the sanctuary. So he says, I've seen you in your sanctuary and gazed upon your power and glory. Your unfailing love is better than life itself. How I praise you. I will praise you as long as I live, lifting up my hands to you in prayer. What does David do when he's in the wilderness? See, when the wilderness breaks in on my life, here's what I do. I worry. Oh man, what are we going to do? Well, maybe if this happens, what if this happens? What if that happens? Maybe I could do this, maybe I could do that. Oh man, this is going to happen. Oh man. And I worry and I try and figure out solutions and I focus on my problems. And that's what most people do. And of course, if there's a problem, you need to focus on it for a little while to fix it, right? But sometimes I don't focus on my problem to fix them. Can I share a little bit of my crazy with you? I'm hoping you can relate. Sometimes I focus on my problems way more than is necessary to fix them. And I know this because sometimes I focus on my problems long after the fact that I've realized that I can't fix them. So there's problems in my life I can't fix. And I worry about them and I gnaw on them like a dog on a bone. And they take up all kinds of headspace and I obsess over them. Even long after I know I can't do anything about it. For example, I'm diabetic, type 2 diabetic, right? And so that affects almost every aspect of my life. How much would it help my diabetes if I just sat around and worried about my diabetes all the time? If I thought about it, if I got a WebMD and researched the symptoms, not only would I have diabetes, but I would probably have cancer in my uterus, right? I'd have all kinds of conditions I didn't know I had before. And when we worry, that's what we do, is we give additional life to things. And we make the monsters bigger because we keep feeding them. But what does David not do as he's in the wilderness? Whether it's Saul hunting him or his son hunting him, whatever the case is, he just focuses on God. He doesn't focus on the problem, he focuses on the Lord. This is how it starts again. Oh God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you. You know what I search for when I have problems? Solutions, escape, deliverance, shelter, fixes. I search for whatever is going to make my life more convenient. And if I'm honest, I'm not always thinking about the fact that there's well over 8 other billion people on this planet who also have interests and who God is working with and doing good for. I'm usually just thinking, well, this sucks and I don't want it in my life, so I'm going to focus on it till I fix it. But he doesn't do that. He searches for God. His soul thirsts for God, not for escape, not for deliverance. He gazes upon God's power and glory. He focuses on God's unfailing love. He praises God. He praises God as long as he lives. And he lifts his hands up in what? Prayer. And so this is what happens. Next few verses. You satisfy me more than the richest feast. Now, he's not writing this after he's out of the wilderness. He's not writing this after he's king again and everything is being fixed and he's back in the castle and he has his cupbearer tasting all the fine food before he eats it for him and he has servants and slaves waiting on him, hand and foot. He's saying this while he's still in the wild, while he's sleeping in the dirt and the dust. While he's in the wilderness, he says, you satisfy me more than the richest feast. By the way, this is the same guy who wrote Psalm 23, which is probably the most famous psalm, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And later in that psalm, he talks about, you prepare a table before me in the midst of my enemies. And the image is he's surrounded by enemies, and God makes a wonderful buffet for him, so they just sit around and eat. So this is what he says here. You satisfy me more than the richest feast. I will praise you with songs of joy. I lie awake thinking of you, meditating on you through the night, because you are my helper. I sing for joy in the shadow of your wings. Isn't that a wonderful picture? He's not exposed in the desert sun. He feels like he's under the wings of a protective God. Because you are my helper, I sing for joy in the shadow of your wings. Now, when we focus on the problem and we worry a lot, when the wilderness is broken into our lives or we feel like we're in the wilderness, do we end up deeply satisfied in our soul? More than the richest feast. A lot of you are my chubby friends, right? Yeah? Okay, the other day, I really wanted nachos. I just wanted nachos. And so I made nachos, because America, right? I made a huge thing of nachos, and I sat nachos in my recliner, in my living room with the wood stove filled with flame, and I ate nachos until I passed out. And I woke up with crumbs all over me, and I kept eating, right? It was a great day. You know that feeling you get when your belly just gets full of the greatest comfort food in the history of man? And you just feel so satisfied. There's no more problems. There's no more worry. You're just overwhelmed with tamales, right? It's just everything's been fixed. That kind of satisfaction, more satisfaction than the richest feast. Is that the satisfaction you get when you're in the wilderness? Are you that satisfied? In the wilderness, are you able to sing for joy? As though you're under the shelter of somebody's wings and protected. That's what David experiences when he just focuses on God. And there's good psychology behind this, by the way. Let me see how much time I have left. Okay, only 2 more hours. So, on the one hand, you can't deny your problems or ignore them or never talk about your negative feelings, right? Because that makes you go crazy. But what we've come to in our culture is we think if you just focus on your problems enough, if you think about them enough, if you talk about them enough, then everything will be fixed. But psychologically, that's the opposite of truth. You got to be somewhere in the middle. For example, if you're depressed, one of the best things you can do is what? Get dressed. Yeah, make your bed. Go outside. Call somebody. What's really good for depression is doing something. Anything. Just doing something. And you know, this is going to be super quick. But a lot of you don't understand how motivation works. Motivation, if you want to increase the behavior, this is basic operant conditioning. If you want to increase the behavior, you get a reward. If you want to decrease the behavior, you get a punishment, right? So if you want to increase motivation, motivation is actually the reward, right? So a lot of you are waiting for the reward before you've done the behavior. But that's not how habits form. You want to do the behavior, then after that, sit in the accomplishment of the behavior you've done, and that's the reward. And that will become motivation to seek the reward more next time. So instead of, I always say, instead of, what am I saying? Instead of motivation, try courage. Instead of motivation, try bravery or discipline. And then motivation happens later. Anyway, that's a bonus sermon for free. But if we focus on our problems constantly, one of the worst things you can do for depression is sit around in your depression and think about why you're depressed all the time. And I've gone through episodes of depression. I had dysthymia for a few years. It's in remission, thank God. But I've experienced depression myself. And when I was depressed, I would sit there and I would just constantly think about the things that were broken in my life and that I was sad and depressed about. And it was a loop, man. I had a hard time breaking out of it. I was just spiraling and spiraling and spiraling. And you know what? That makes me more depressed is when you're focusing so much on your problems. So there's a balance. And it's interesting, in British culture, they, a lot of times I notice, discourage people from crying. Like, chin up. Come on, let's go, carry on. You know, I think, well, that's not very therapeutic. They should sit there and talk about why they want to cry for 1,000 hours, and you should hear them. Well, it turns out that works too. They see you're sad. They know they're with you. It turns out that the thing you focus on in your life is the thing you give more life to. That's the animal you feed, and that's the thing that gets bigger. And you get to choose your monster. Is your monster going to be the chaos in your life or the cherubim blocking the door or whatever is in your life? Or is the monster going to be the wild God who can't be tamed, who actually fights for you and tears apart your enemies and not you? You get to feed one or the other. And what David does is he focuses on God, which takes his eye off of constantly the problem. He focuses on God and he seeks him all the time. And then he finds satisfaction in God. He's deeply satisfied in God. And then this is how he ends this verse. I lie awake thinking of you, meditating on you through the night because you are my helper. I sing for joy in the shadow of your wings. I cling to you. Your strong right hand holds me securely. But those plotting to destroy me will come to ruin. They will go down into the depths of the earth. They will die by the sword and become the food of jackals. But the king will rejoice in God. All who trust in him will praise him, while liars will be silenced. So he turns his eyes to God. He's satisfied in God, and then he clings to God. He continues holding on to God. You know, in the New Testament, we see the wilderness happen too. You guys remember this? Jesus shows up. He comes out of nowhere and he gets baptized. And you think, okay, this is awesome. He's going to start raising people from the dead. He's going to start preaching amazing sermons. He's going to start healing lepers of their skin diseases. He's going to cast out demons. He's going to do amazing things. And what does Jesus do? First thing, goes out to the desert. Right after his baptism, he's led by the Holy Spirit out into the wilderness. And not only does he live in the wilderness, he intentionally abstains from eating for 40 days. What's the longest you fasted? 40 days is a long time. So he went 40 days without food because not only did he go to the wild where wild things were, and was there a wild thing in the desert that he encountered? Yeah, I don't know if you guys know the story, but Jesus went to war with Satan while he was in the wilderness. Satan's pretty wild. That's a wild animal. That's a monster. So Jesus goes out, he battles with Satan, and not only is he in the wilderness, but additionally, he wants to show that he's clinging to God. He's only going to find satisfaction in God, and he's holding on to God so much, he refuses to eat for 40 days. Now, I don't know about you, but if I don't eat for a few days, I'm not stronger, I'm weaker. And he goes on for 40 days, and at the end of this wilderness, Satan comes up for this battle. And Jesus wins. And then he comes back, angels attend him, he comes back, and then he starts preaching, and he starts with his first sermon. And that's how Jesus' ministry begins. So whereas in the Old Testament, everybody who went out to the wild, like all these Israelites and them, and they failed God in the wild, Jesus goes out in the wild and he is faithful to God. You know, Christmas is a complicated season for a lot of people. Like, I know your family's messed up, right? I have one too. I know this can be a stressful time of year. There are reasons we actually choose worry and anxiety and focusing and feeding the monster itself of the problem rather than focusing on God. And I don't have time to get into all the payoffs, but real quick, I'll tell you some of them. One is it gives us a false sense of control, because by imagining that we're involved in a situation through worry, we pretend we're in a place we're not. It also gives us a sense of certainty, because we think we can anticipate all variables, although we can't. So we just, by sheer force of imagination, we overpower the obvious uncertainty that is in our life with certainty. It also placates our perfectionism, because we pretend like we can have a perfect life if we just anticipate every variable, which we can't. That ship sailed a long time ago. There's a bunch of reasons we go to worry. But I have one good reason not to go to worry. Because it makes you miserable. And it keeps you from God. So what do you do instead? I just want to give you a little trick. If you're saying, what if this happens? What if that happens? I want you to change that to saying, okay, what now? So not what if, what now? And there's one more layer. You can't just ask why. Why is this happening? Why is God letting this happen? Why is this? Why is that? I'll tell you right now, you don't know. Nobody else knows why either. Like, I've read so much philosophy and so much theology, and nobody's figured it out yet, okay? You're not going to crack the code in your weakened state, so let it go. So instead of why or what if, I want you to ask what now? Real quick. I usually have 15 more minutes in my sermon, so I'm going to haul. You guys ready for this? Okay, the reason we have emotions is because they're going to give us information that's supposed to move us to do something. Emotions lead to action. That's why when you're angry, you get this impulse to do stuff, right? You're angry, you get an impulse to yell. You get an impulse to break something. When you're angry, your impulse isn't to take a nap. Right? Anger drives you to action. Fear drives you to action. You run away from the alligator. Okay? Love drives you to an action, and hate drives you to different actions. So emotions exist because they give us information faster than our reason can, and emotion is the thing we use to make most of our decisions quickly, and it's good. Because if an alligator wants to eat you, you don't have time to evaluate the situation, you just need to run, right? Okay, so that's what emotions are for. But if we wallow in an emotion, like depression or sadness or anger or bitterness or righteous indignation, actually, let me say self-righteous indignation, which is different. If we've gotten addicted to recreational outrage and our new hobby is getting on the internet and losing our mind, right? Whatever it is that you wallow in emotionally, if that doesn't move you to action, you're abusing your emotions. So you ask, what now? Okay, I feel lonely. And I've been through bouts of loneliness. Those of you in ministry, you probably relate, or in any helping profession. And thought, Lord, I sacrifice so much for you. I read so many books. I spend time with so much people. I spend so much time in prayer. There's other things I could have done which would have made me way more money. God, I've done all this for you. How come you've abandoned me? How come I'm by myself? How come there's no friends to be found around me? Why, Lord? You can take that road if you want. But it's going to lead to misery and separation from God because you're not focusing on the right thing. Instead, you can say, okay, and this is what I hope I do in my best times, is, okay, God, I'm lonely. What now? Well, if I'm lonely, I should probably do stuff to address that. Like maybe I'll call my boy Mark and make fun of him for having weak ribs. Right? Maybe I'll reach out to a friend. Maybe I'll connect with somebody. Maybe I'll leave the house. Maybe I'll take my dog for a walk. What should I do to address this loneliness? But it's weird because God is calling us to this feast at this table, and a lot of times we just prefer to drink out of the toilet. And we go to the world and all these things, and we go to things we can't control. Think, why, God? Why don't you just make my wife love me perfectly? And of course, by that I mean anticipate everything I want, every moment I want it, and that she could always be paying attention to me and making me feel good all the time. Right? It's like I'm 7 years old. But my wife controls my wife. I don't control my wife. She has her own walk with God. And there's very few things in this world I can control. I'm guessing you're in the same boat. And so when we take our focus and we put it on the monster, we put it on the chaos, we put it on the why and the what if, and we're focusing on the wrong thing and we're not focusing on the Lord, that's when we get so wrapped up in this weird emotional tangle that Satan has us in his jaws. And we don't have our balance and we're easy to throw. So instead of what if, ask what now. Lord, okay, what does it look like today if I focus on you, if I'm obedient to you, if I do exactly what your will is for my life, no matter what? If I surrender to you, if I follow you today, what now? And I promise you that's way more productive, way more godly, and way more helpful than asking God, hey, explain to my little brain how come all this stuff is happening so I can feel like I actually control it. It's better to say, God, what now? A couple years ago, my mom fell and hit her head. You guys know about this. You were here when it happened. Not here at the church, it happened at my house, but you guys were with me, you know. But we took my mom in. She had uncontrolled diabetes, and she started having strokes. She came up one morning, and she could only talk with half of her face. So we took her in, and her condition was deteriorating pretty quickly. And one morning, she was sleeping in the basement for a long time, and I went and checked on her, and she was just laying there, so I went back upstairs. A few more hours passed, and I thought, man, she's been down there a long time. So I went and checked her, and again, I said, hey, Ma, how are you? And I helped her sit up. When I helped her sit up, I noticed there was blood on the pillow under her head. And so she had happened to lay on the side that the blood was coming out after she fell and hit her head on the sidewalk of the street or wherever it happened. She had somehow made her way back to bed, and she laid down. And so I got her up, and I took her to the hospital. And she could speak at that point a little bit, but then throughout the day, she lost her powers of speech, so I started to have her type me stuff on my iPad, you know. And then she just kept deteriorating, and she was able to come home a few days later for hospice, and we took care of her until she passed. But that was kind of out of nowhere, and it was very unexpected. And you know, when things like that happen, I could just, okay, why, God? We finally moved her in, our relationship's repairing, like things are happening, and then you're just going to take her from me. I mean, what if she didn't fall? What if I was just there? What if we just did this? What if we asked her to walk with a walker? All these things to try and control something I can't control. Instead, what if we just say, okay, what now, Lord? What do I do with this complicated mess I have in my hands now? Not in me, but outside of me. What do I do with my guilt? I feel like I wasn't a good enough son. What do I do with my fear that I'm going to lose my mom? What do I do with my sadness? What do I do with my sense of helplessness? And what now? What do I do to help my mom? And to help her know she's as loved as possible before we say goodbye. I want her to feel as much of Jesus' love as possible before she goes and feels as much of Jesus' love as possible. Like, what now, Lord? What do I do? And we live in a culture now, and I'm going to end with this because I'm already over time. We live in a culture now that encourages our kids and you to focus as much as they possibly can on problems in their life. In fact, the more problems you have, the more status you have. If your life's put together, it's a hard way to get attention or to get affirmation from friends. But if you have a mental illness, maybe a few, right? If you're somehow oppressed or burdened by the system, we just live in a world that for some reason is rewarding victimhood and just rewarding people for focusing on feeding the wrong monster. Church, do you see all these kids up here today? Like, we need to pastor these children. We need to walk them in God's way. So church, whatever wilderness you're facing now in life, whatever wilderness you're facing this Christmas season, try and not go so far this way where you just dwell in the issue. Instead, ask, what now? What does faithfulness on my part look like in this situation? What does it look like for me to be obedient to you today? Instead of, how do I manipulate situations so that they can appease me today? And I'm telling you, if God has called you to something, you have a purpose for your life, and you're being obedient to God every single day, you'll be much stronger when the storms come, and you'll be much more prepared for when chaos breaks into your life, because it will. If it hasn't already, you're due for another round. Like, that's life, man. It happens. Yeah, chaos breaks in, the wilderness shows up. So let's close in prayer, church. I pray that we would be a faithful church, that would be a church that focuses on you, Lord, that would be a church that does not focus so much our own issues or on our own little world, that we don't find our satisfaction in you. Lord, help us not to fall into these emotional spirals of worry, of fear, of anxiety, of depression, of anger, of hatred, of bitterness, or of self-righteousness. Lord, instead, help us to be humble. Help us to acknowledge you as God, even when we don't understand you, even though we're afraid of the plan. Lord, help us to seek you earnestly. Early in the morning to seek you, to find our satisfaction in you, to sing for joy in the shadow of your wings, to cling to you, to meditate on you through all the watches of the night. Lord, help us to focus on you. And help us to orient our lives in a way to where we're faithful to you and we're doing what you would have us do. Where our lives are demonstrating love, where they're demonstrating courage, where they're demonstrating compassion and forgiveness, and assertiveness so that we can do what you've called us to do. Lord, give us the courage to be faithful. I do pray for healing in all the families and as much reconciliation and harmony as possible this Christmas season. But more than that, I pray for faith, that we would just trust you, that you are the wildest creator, that you cannot be tamed. And though you're not safe, you are good. And you work for our good and you love us. So help us to focus on you.